So Milo's going to start us off. The triumvirate's a little different this year around. So Martin's taking a back seat and Milo's stepping up and helping us out. But we're always the rule of three around here. So I'll let Milo and Tom start us off, and then we'll probably switch up who's got what. So, but if everybody can see that screen. Cool.
We're good.
All right.
Man, a well-oiled machine. I would, before I started, I wanted to heap more praise upon both Kelly and Jen for keeping this going. We had such a great event at the library a few years ago. I don't think anyone would anticipate this happening. So I think it is important to keep that momentum going, and hopefully next year we're back in a more familiar format. So I know it's a lot of hard work and a lot of enthusiasm too, much needed. So I appreciate that. But yeah, we are here to talk about mainly cartography, right? This is a focus. GIS has so many things. There's so many parts to it. That's one of the things that I love about it, and probably you all too. But we're going to talk a little bit about cartography today. But I did want to introduce myself and my colleagues. A lot of you know me, have known me for a long time. Those that don't, I'm Tom Harner with MVRPC. Been here for a long time. Been working on GIS for a while, and it's great. I studied geography in school, so been doing it my whole professional career. It's pretty awesome. Also with us is Milo, who, speaking of professional careers, he kept on a pretty good tradition of interning with us and impressing us so much, we ended up hiring him as a planner. And that's we have many good interns over the years, and of those, a few end up working with us for a long time. So Milo's been a great addition. And I can't imagine starting your career in the middle of a pandemic like this. You know, again, no one would anticipate that, but we're very pleased to have him. And another colleague is Catherine. She's worked with me for over 10 years now, and she has just been really good to work with her. She's a cartographic expert. When we need some really good advice, I usually point people down the hallway, say, talk to Catherine. She probably knows more. I'm very much a generalist. I know a little bit about a lot of stuff. She knows a lot about cartography, a lot about other GIS stuff as well. And I will say, as far as cartography goes, and its importance with GIS, you know, I always draw back about 20 years ago. There was an executive director, and she would tour through our agency, and she'd eventually get to the back of the agency, you know, where all the work goes on, and there would be just me and maybe one other person, and she would always describe this is where the pretty pictures are made, and that would always super irritate me. So I'd end up gritting my teeth and smiling in a certain way, you know. And you all probably feel the same way, because there's so much more with GIS, with the databases and so much more than all of that. But it was never really addressed when she described it that way. But to be fair, she was kind of right. Because if we don't communicate effectively, all this hard work we're doing, it sometimes just falls on deaf ears. So the idea of good, competent, efficient cartography is really crucial to GIS. We can do all the numbers crunching and data munching we want, but if we can't, you know, convey that point we want to make, no one's going to pay any attention to it. So that's not good. So next slide, Milo, if you want. I won't speak for too long, so I don't want to scare you away. But again, you know, as the title there indicates, it's not one versus the other. I think some folks come at GIS from a lot of different backgrounds. You know, I was an odd one that I studied geography, and certainly geographers wind up in GIS, but I found a lot of people in GIS that come from computer backgrounds. Maybe they studied environmental science or something like that and sort of wind up in GIS. So some folks have a cartographic background and have taken classes. Some folks haven't. That's why I think this session may really help. So even if you have taken these sorts of classes, it'll be some good reminders and refreshers. If you haven't, well, then this is really good tips and tricks you can use in GIS. But it's not one versus the other. They're completely the same thing. So if you come at it from a technical background, you're not so good with visuals and aesthetics, well, always a chance to get better. And that's one of the points here, is that there, you know, ArcGIS and the other platforms, of course, do a really terrific job of setting you up. You add that stuff, and it's really easy to get what is basically a good looking map, but don't overlook the opportunity to tweak it and tune it and make it a little bit better and make it more your own. Next, Mile. And then this just, reiterates that point of design standards. There's two things we cover here. One are standards and principles that you would find in a textbook. I have behind me on a shelf, I have a 40-year-old textbook that talks about cartography. The things it talks about still matter now. It was a completely different medium, but all that stuff still matters. But also the medium we work with now, whether it's ArcGIS Online or some other product, there are different ways to approach it. There's different strengths and weaknesses and different ways to get what you want. So I know Milo and Catherine will do a really good job sharing some of these tips, and I hope that you all can get something out of it.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that great introduction. So yeah, I'm Milo Simpson. I'm going to take it away from here, and Catherine will tack on a bit later. But we really want to hit hard on some of those cartographic standards and techniques. So one of the most important concepts to really understand, and this is very overarching and really encompasses everything, is visual hierarchy. You don't want a map such as the one on the left where you're really having a hard time distinguish what's important, what is what. All of those lines kind of blend together and there's nothing to distinguish between them. So that's an example of some not so good visual hierarchy. But as you can see on the right, visual hierarchy, when applied to each symbol, can really show what is important, what isn't, what magnitude it's important, as well as distinguishing between different types of data. So obviously those lines don't represent the same thing as the hatched areas on the inside. That's because visual hierarchy gives that ability to have the eye perceive multiple different types of data just at different levels, frequencies, and different classifications. So the theme throughout me and Catherine's part here for cartography is going to be visual hierarchy kind of being the overarching rule to everything as it applies to these concepts we explore some more in detail. So how do you accomplish visual hierarchy? Once again, through many different ways. We'll hit on most of these, not all. We could go on forever about all the different ways to symbolize. But the big ones are shape, size, color, orientation, texture, pattern, proximity, graphic effects, and text. Each one of these is something that you want to pay attention to when you're in that cartographic process. You could have a great map with most of these, but if one of these is off, it can really throw off a really good map and create kind of an awkward looking or, it could misrepresent data as well, which is also a very important concept to understand. That way you're not lying with maps, as Catherine taught me in cartography class a couple of years ago. So yes, hierarchy, very important. The first concept we'll talk about is size. So as we all know, maps are made up of many different elements. And for most of those elements, you can scale the size. So for a point, this might be how big the point is. For a line, it's how thick it is. And maybe for 3D objects as well, to what scale is that 3D object, larger or smaller? And usually you want to show, a smaller amount of data as a small dot, larger as a large dot. And that can really help to visualize quickly for the viewer, what is either less important or more important, or from a data standpoint, what has less, what has more. And so size can be very important, especially also for fonts, titles, more than just on the map. But also, you don't want to use a size 100 font, if it's going to take up the entire map. You want to use something more discrete, and that flows well with the map that you're creating. So as an example, here we have the population of counties in the Northeast, and you can kind of see what this map is showing with size. You can very clearly tell that New York and Chicago have large populations. These are just raw population counts. But what you can't really tell is the difference between pretty much every other county, right? Like Columbus looks like it's barely larger than the surrounding counties. And it looks like it's pretty uniformly, distributed, which is not the true story. This map isn't technically incorrect because it's proportional, so it is showing how, compared to these huge metropolitan areas like Chicago and New York, everything else is, fairly on the same level. But to take it to the next level, you can adjust into classes, of course, and we all know that breaking up into classes is a very important concept for cartography because it allows the user to not have to distinguish between two of these counties in rural Pennsylvania with their naked eye. That's impossible. So by setting, 5 or so classes, changing the range, through ArcGIS Online, as this is, they make it pretty simple. Once your data's in there, just go to the symbology, go to the circles, and you should be able to change the size and classes, which will give us something that it's much more easier to understand from the viewer's standpoint. You can still see that Chicago, New York, those places have large populations, but you can now see how Columbus, Ohio is not actually, close to the same population as the surrounding counties. It's classed differently, and visually it's more striking to see that Columbus is, middle of the range, total population. I should be saying Franklin County. I'm sorry, I keep saying Columbus. Franklin County is a much better visualized as compared to the counties around it. And so size is one thing that is important to understand as a concept for cartography, because as you can see in the last few slides, if the size is not, visualized in a very nuanced way, then you might lose some of the impact of the story you're trying to present with your map. And so how that was accomplished here is you can round the classes to the nearest 10,000, and that can kind of create an easier to understand legend. And then it's broken up into 5 classes, to give it those 5 distinct circles that are easier to understand. And we'll talk about the rule of 5 here in a couple of slides, but you usually want to keep anything that's going to be, visually distinct or visually similar within a certain type of visualization to about 5 classes. But we'll talk about that here in a second. So color is very important, not just in cartography, but especially in cartography. It can really make or break a good map, and color is one of those things that is very, very, if you dig into it, it can be infinitely useful or infinitely harmful. And by that, I mean color, has so many variables and so many possibilities that you can be overwhelmed, and you don't want to overwhelm yourself with different colors to use on your map. So we're going to talk about a few different concepts to help you narrow it down, but also give you the freedom to choose, the colors that appropriately tell your story, are visually pleasing, and don't conflict with each other. So science says that lights, are the way that your eyes perceive different wavelengths on the electromagnetic spectrum. And they're usually made up of, which is value, which I always wondered what HSV was when I was, symbolizing on ArcMap or AGOL, and now I finally understand that hue, saturation, and value are the 3 most important concepts. And so saturation is basically the vividness of a color, and that's basically going to be, how much of that specific color is being visualized. I'm not a scientist, so I apologize if these aren't the sciencey words to use, but basically that takes you from a scale of very not red to as red as possible is what the saturation will give you. Value is the brightness, so a value of 0 would be, essentially completely, on one end it's going to be completely white, one end completely black, and then within that range is going to be all of that color, brightness. And then finally, the hue is, what discernible color it is. So the hue could be red, blue, green, orange, what hue is it representing? And so you can see on the right, there's a few different examples of how light works, but we'll move on to applying it in a cartographic way. So there are different color schemes, and these are 3 of them. There's honestly a ton. that I could talk about. I know that recently I've been doing some things with color, and I found out there's tetradic colors, quadratic colors, like an infinite amount, really. One of the hardest parts about colors is it's not finding tools to help you with colors, but to narrow down the tools to ones that are actually useful. Because if you look up like color calculators online, there are just way too many. But the three most important ones to understand for cartographic purposes are analogous, complementary, and monochromatic colors. And each one of these can be used in a different type of classification, which we'll talk about here in a second. But basically, analogous colors are right next to each other on the color wheel, so they are visually distinct, but they do still share some attributes. So you see there the yellow, orange, and green. They are separate colors, but they do kind of flow together as analogous colors. Below that, you'll see complementary colors, which is the opposite side of the color wheel. So yellow and purple, some blues and reds, that sort of thing. They're really good at showing the contrast and the difference between things. And generally, I'd say almost always, complementary colors do look good together. You don't want to overdo it, of course. You don't want to, max the vividness, max everything, show the complementary. That can become a little harsh on the eyes. But generally, complementary colors are very well together, as the name implies. And lastly is monochromatic. So these are colors this is a color, but different values as far as the how much of that color it is. So you can see it's only selecting the yellow there on the right in that color wheel. And so basically the monochromatic version of yellow would be very yellow to a much more dull and much more, not dull necessarily, but a much lighter and much less distinct yellow. And we'll see that here in the next few slides when we talk about chloroplast maps. There we go. So yes, there are three very important data classification schemes you want to understand for colors, what type of data you're showing. So if you're using any of these three types, sequential, divergent, and qualitative, there are certain color schemes that you'll generally want to use that fit very well with them. So sequential data, of course, is showing like a ramp or from one lower value to a higher value or vice versa. And so you want to show that relationship of going from less to more to less. You don't need to get in the middle, and it is showing one variable. So for that, you want to use a color scheme that is gradual in its increase or decrease, but is still visually distinct, allowing the user to see that something is changing or that something is less or more than that original starting value. The next is divergent. So you'll want to, have a breakpoint sometimes where 0 is the middle, or maybe some set value is the middle point, and you're only interested in knowing what's above and what's below. In that case, you'll want to use divergent, and these are where complementary colors can be used very effectively, because as you can see, a nice green and a nice purple will show that maybe, the purple is increasing, the green is decreasing, vice versa. And you can very clearly tell that relationship because of how it gradually becomes more vivid of a color on both ends. So you can see what the major increase, the major decrease is, that sort of stuff. So last one was qualitative, and this is a little bit different than the first two, representing something necessarily that is on a continuum, on a scale. This is more distinct and categorical. So this is something where it would be like, classifying based off of, what's the best pizza flavor in each state or something, what's the most popular flavor. You want to use a color for each type of pizza on each state, something like that. There's no numbers necessarily, it's just showing categorical data. And for that, you can use, a pretty distinct color ramp. You don't want the colors to clash, of course, which we'll talk about. But you can use colors, across many different types. So talking about the chloroplast mapping earlier and the 5-shade rule that I mentioned, there are some limitations to using color. And one of those limitations is, unfortunately, our vision, human eyes. We were only really designed to distinguish between 5 or so different hues of a color. So on the left there, you can see pretty distinctly that there are 5 different levels of this total population map, ranging from a smaller, very light purple to a heavier, darker purple that shows more population. On the right, though, you can see that when you break it into 8 classes, it's kind of hard for your eyes to tell what is what. You can very clearly see the 2 ends of it. You can see the light, you can see the dark, but in between there it becomes very muddy and very hard to tell what each county, which classification it falls into. So whenever you're using color, try to keep it to about 5 shades. You can break the rule depending on what your data is, or if you can find a really good color scheme to show it off, such as this one on the left, where suddenly it's not just one color. It's no longer technically monochromatic, but you're able to find a color that does kind of blend in with those other 7 shades and gradually shows the difference. So here we've changed it from that very light purple to a tannish color, and then we gradually go to kind of like a purple gray, darker purple, darkest purple, and that can allow you to break that limitation of 5 shades and give you more classes when you're classifying data in this way. And so that's very useful in classifying that way. So this one's very important, and we've all seen a map that does this at one point or another, and that is to not overdo it with the color, or to be very color conscious to not create visual conflicts. So if you're, for example, using a base map that has lots of water or lots of something of a certain color, in this example it's going to be a lake, you do not want to put blue over it, especially if you want to show off that lake. Then you're kind of losing that visual clarity. We like to throw on transparency as like a one-size-fits-all to fix things, but when colors are very similar, they still conflict. And maybe in this map, it's not a huge deal because you're not focused on the lake, but it is something to keep in mind. If you're using, forest data and you're using green as your visualizing color, that might get confusing. So just keep that in mind, to be conscious of that. But that being said, please feel free to use the same colors and color schemes on your maps for titles and other elements and borders, because that does create that visual cohesiveness and it's very visually appealing. Just be careful what exactly you're showing on the base map versus the visualized data. So we're going to move on from kind of the visualizing part to some different types of maps and visualizations. We talked about Chloroplast and now we are going to move on to density.
All right. Trying to see if I can pass the handoff here. I'm echoing, so I'm double checking.
If everybody could make sure that their microphone is muted enough.
Okay. Okay, well, I'm no longer echoing. I'm gonna try. I tried sharing it first, but so let me see if I can do that again. Is this okay? Can people see?
Yes.
Okay. Double. All right. Good. So I guess I hit the gun on that a little bit too early. So this presentation is a little bit disjointed because it's kind of those what's the all-encompassing and those little things. There's a lot of different types of things we want to hit on. As Milo mentioned, I have been teaching at Wright State a little bit for cartography, and it is one of those things you kind of notice as you're going through making maps. We've got a few themes that run throughout. You always want to be thinking about when you're making your maps, who's the audience and what data is important. And there are a lot of those types of things that run consistently that I think by now are kind of all imbued in our heads. But there's some other little things that you just don't quite either know, or you've forgotten, or it's only mentioned maybe once a year. And so it's kind of hard to kind of remember where all that comes into play. So Milo went ahead and set us up with sort of size and color, and I wanted to talk and transition. One of the things he had mentioned about size was those proportional dots, and sort of the larger the dot you get, the larger the value it's supposed to represent. And that's a great and easy way to do things, and also is the sort of the default way that Esri would allow us in AGOL in their Map Viewer Classic. That was sort of the default way of being able to show something. You could either do proportional maps or you could do choropleth maps, but you couldn't do dot density. And then in 2019, when Esri started to unroll their Map Viewer beta, which is now out of beta, they have sort of these extra effects and extra capabilities. And so we're trying to tie some of this in with that new Map Viewer to talk about some of the very cool things that we'll get to be able to do as Esri sort of transitions out of Map Viewer Classic and into Map Viewer Beta. Fair warning, those that can't do teach, and I have, besides cartography, we're going to put a pin in that part. Well, don't think too hard about that. But for the Map Viewer itself, as opposed to Map Viewer Classic, we've spent a little bit of time in the new version and enhanced to get a better sense of what it does, but because it still is playing somewhat nicely with our applications and still it's still a little bit disjointed, we've been a little slow to fully adopt that. But we really started to take a look, and we're liking what we're seeing, and I'm hoping that transition can be smooth. But one of the things that I appreciated about the Map Viewer itself is that it does allow for these dot density maps. And that is when you want to be trying to depict magnitude by frequency. So one dot equals something, how many, and sort of those enumeration units, rather than a single dot being the larger the dot. The idea is there you'd have many dots to represent a large portion. So when you're thinking about creating this, we want to be looking at that magnitude by frequency rather than that symbol size. And so you'd be thinking about that geographic distribution. So the example shown here, you can start to see, okay, where might I find corn per grain? Again, this is out of a textbook here, but would just start to show that concentration then largely in those Midwestern states. So if you've got a difference between a dot density map versus just a map of point features, you've got that dot representing more than one entity. The locations then are going to be representative of the distribution. You're not necessarily saying it's in that exact spot, but it's sort of the general idea for that. When we're looking at this, you want to be thinking that the topics that work really well is basically things that need to be counted, things with value. So here, census data, stuff that we deal with a lot. Other statistics, vital statistics perhaps, maybe incidents or accidents, crime rates, anything that you might think about as a heat map. A dot density map can also is a sort of a different way of doing that. So when you're doing it, if you were doing this on desktop, you would be having these creation steps. Okay, we need to determine where the dots should be placed. We need to select their size and how many of whatever it is that we're mapping that unit value needs to represent. So the lower the unit value, the more dots. And then we need to finally actually go ahead and place those dots within the selected regions. And if you were not working for local government, that might eventually lead to profit. We have to cross that off. We are not going to do that. So when we would actually use them, again, sort of like we're talking about those crime or heat maps and sort of those incidents that would be going on, those discrete observations that would go ahead and change smoothly over space. So agricultural population data, those types of things. That's a really great time to use it. Just a plug that just because you can doesn't mean you should. So dot maps will represent data that is consisting of discrete observations that change more or less smoothly over space. That idea of smoothly over space means you don't want to be using a dot density map. If that's the case, you're going to end up with a picture like you see here, where it kind of looks like, you know, Europe has the chicken pox. So you want to be thinking of places that have or that show those sort of range where things actually are changing. It's not a smooth surface. So data with small attribute ranges. So if you only have a narrow, maybe the range of the data is like 1 to 10, that's probably also not a very good range for using the dot density. You want to be sticking with something that has a lot of range to show. That's why population totals might be a good example. There's usually quite a large range within that. So Versatility of dot density, it's easy for map readers to understand, and so that is a very appealing nature, and that is in the pro column. But again, if you're going to use it incorrectly, then it ends up in the con column, because it may lead to more chances of misunderstanding for your readers, especially if the understanding or the misconception of the dot being in that spot equals that's where its actual location is. So you want to be kind of treading cautiously on that. Again, also ideally, you would want to be using an equal area map projection, which we don't necessarily do on web maps, but that's kind of just a wishful thinking on some of that. But regardless, being able to use a dot density map can really help for some of that understanding, and it kind of gives a little bit, rather than the reader having to go back and forth within the large circles or the proportions, a quick, easy underway to see where there is more of something or less of something. So if you're doing this in the map viewer, you have a couple of different, they do tend to make it pretty easy to do. You would have your option similar to Map Viewer Classic, where you can just pick which version. Are you doing counts and amounts or color and size? That's what we may have seen in Map Viewer Classic. But one of the new ones that we have is the dot density, which is that third one, or excuse me, that fourth one down. You would select that, and then after that, on the style options, you can pick color. You would have that sliding value for how much the dots represent. In this case, we have it down to 1 dot equals 450. The background symbol, what it's referring to is, especially if you're doing population by county, let's say, it would draw that county is that boundary. So the background symbol would be that county outline. So whether you're going to show that or not. And then there's that last one where it shows vary dots by scale. This is something that you want to be thinking about, and especially when I was playing around with this at first, when you zoom in and out of the map itself, I'll show a quick version of what this would be. You can see here in the lower left-hand corner, it says 1 dot equals 450, which is what we put in our slides. If I were to zoom in on this, if I had not turned off that vary dot by scale, because it's automatically selected on, if I zoom in, it's going to change the dot value automatically, which I guess is good for like an exploratory nature and where you are. But once you have it at maybe the number that you want to make sure that that's checked off. So, because otherwise, if your reader is going to be going into this, you've lost complete control of sort of how the understanding might be, and it's not necessarily intuitive that that number is going to change. That's something that eagle eyes might notice, but certainly not at the superficial. So it is a chance for readers to misunderstand. So that is why I would recommend turning that off once you know which version it is. But this would be the map that you would get. It would churn for a minute, and then it would spit this out. And so here's an example again of that population by county. So that earlier map that Milo showed with the proportional dots is now being represented here with dot density. We can get those, again, those quick hits, learning the eastern seaboard, very populated, areas of Columbus and Cleveland as well. The technical thing I did want to mention with this is that the reason it can draw relatively quickly, I mean, again, time is a construct, but for this, it's not actually drawing dots at all. These are tiny, and they're like, it's more like a texture. So it's a large image where each pixel has a random value, and then Esri has chosen to fill in the pixels, and that's what they're terming as the dots. According to the threshold such that draws approximately your hopeful amount of dots within that given region. So this is sort of like they've put in a bunch of chances and sort of algorithms and things to kind of get a sense of what it is that you're after using the numbers that they put in, and then this is that approximation of that. If we were really going to be able to fully have the dot density ability, it would involve creating a geometry extrusion step in order to create the real dots, as opposed to just filling in the pixel, and that would allow the scaling the dots arbitrarily. But that's the technical explanation that I read. What you need to know from that is that explicit control over the dot size. So you can see, especially in maybe rural Pennsylvania, you can see these tiny little specks. It's still pretty hard to get a sense of. I would have liked to have made those bigger, and that's the Cartographic side of me, I'm wincing a little bit at some of the sizes of these. It's still pretty hard to see. But the explicit control for that dot size has not been granted just yet. I'm hoping maybe in a future release. So it is something that is relatively difficult for Esri to give to us right now, just because of some of the background work that would have to happen on their end. So it seems like a simple step, but it's still something that still to come. But we have this ability, at least to create some basic dot density that we did not have before. So it is still a net positive. But if you're still trying to work with the fact that you don't have these dot sizes, what can maybe we do to make this map better? I would try upping the contrast, just so that way the dots become a little bit easier to see. So before, pleasing navy blue is still able to see some patterns. I think the pink, at least, you can start to it starts to pop some a little bit more. New York might be a bit blinding, but some of the others you can start to see some of that lesser information. If this contrast isn't enough, the other thing to do is then, if it doesn't, you up the contrast on your layer end and that works. You can up the contrast on the back end, on the base map. So here we might use the dark gray one, and that's where those brighter colors then might stand out a little bit more. You can also try lowering the dot count, so that way one more dot is representing fewer people, just to try to up the numbers of that. But that is also you run the risk of giving the reader a false impression of population numbers, since the top of the range is already a solid color. So this is the kind of thing of play around, but be aware of what you're giving up. And that's kind of what a lot of cartography is understanding, when I turn this dial, what does that do on the back end? And is that going to enhance reader understanding, or is it going to negatively affect it? And so that's sort of that push-pull with dot density. Milo earlier had mentioned about type and text and how important that can be within the maps, especially when you're thinking about size. Typography is that general term that we'll use to just talk about text. This could be words that appear on maps, whether they're labels or text blocks, titles, the legend, anything there. This all helps to make a map easier to understand. It also makes a map more attractive. And so this is another little thing that can have a big impact on your map itself. So this is something that probably is a little bit easier to control in a print environment, especially if you're still working with Pro for a printout or a map that you're going to be putting on a piece of paper and putting out somewhere, or possibly exporting then as a JPEG itself. You have a little bit more control over that. But perhaps it's something you'll be thinking about putting in the web environment, whether it's actually in a story map or any other type of internet medium itself, in order to allow more of an interactive bit. Still a very important concept. So if we're thinking about text, we want to be thinking about how the words or the letters fit together or don't fit together. This will be accomplished with spacing, leading, kerning. So these are just a couple of guidelines. There's no hard and fast rule. And kind of some of the stuff waxes and wanes, and some of its personal preference. Again, you kind of need to play around a little bit. So it's also font dependent. So I can't say, oh, the kerning always needs to be this value, or the leading always needs to be this value. So there are a couple of obvious examples when one does it wrong. There's in some of these explanations here. So this sort of shows again, the kerning is the one that's sort of my favorite down below, is sort of the result of keying is the result of improper kerning, of where that R and N come so close together they form other letters. So that is just something to keep in mind when you're working with text itself. Think about the spaces of the letters together, think about then how the words go together or how the lines go together. So when we're thinking about the fonts themselves and looking at this was from Eileen Buckley, whose job at Esri is to kind of work with some of the other design features. And some of the things that she's cited that good web fonts have are these distinct letter shapes with a tall X height. And so the diagram on the right shows you, that top one shows you what we mean by when we're talking about X height. So there you can see it's the top line for where the lowercase letters are reaching. So you also have cap height, which is at the very top for the capital letters, or for where the F might end up, is that ascender height. You have the baseline, which is the lower line for where the letters will start. as well as the descender height if you have letters that fall below the baseline. So that's just sort of the general terms that designers and graphic designers might have within this. So when they're referring to tall X height, they want to mean, again, you have those letters that have a big space to actually form all of their forms. So you want to have plenty of space between characters. You don't want the letters squished. And so you can kind of see some of that in that lower diagram about the clear and distinct letter shapes, where that wide width in that N is something that would be considered a good thing to have within a web font. And then you also just want to have space within the actual characters. So again, you don't want the letters all squished up against each other like we're talking about some of that with that kerning. So that's sort of what, when you're looking at fonts, because different fonts come in and out of vogue, and sometimes a story map will have a font and then will no longer be supported, and they might put something in. Chances are they're going to put in something good anyway, that they've already done the thinking on that. But if you're choosing to work out of the box or something that has a bit more proficiency, or you're trying to work with something that may be both print and later web, these are things to kind of be thinking about yourself, so that way you can customize. So when you're picking a font within the web map, besides everything I just said, you mainly want to be looking for legibility and accessibility. You need to be thinking what happens when that font is displayed. Some different browsers sometimes will react differently. We all have seen that with some of our applications. But so web-safe fonts are generally universally accepted. But again, if I'll pick something that was originally meant for Microsoft Word to be printed out, it may not have the same ability to be read if I put it up on a screen instead of just in my hands. So you want to make sure that the majority of your visitors see the font like you intended them to. If you pick something too specialized, sometimes the web will turn it into those weird characters with some accents. You know, the E with an accent, I think, doesn't always get translated appropriately. And so then you end up maybe with some quotes instead, or some other type of character that lets you know that it didn't transfer over. So if you're going to be making a web map, you want to be using a font designed for the web. And so a couple of these other fonts that might be good might be Arial, or Lucinda Grande, Roboto, I think, is the Google default one that Esri also carries. Verdana also easy to use with that. That's text, but then what about labels, and what is so important with labels? Well, labels will go ahead and they'll do a couple of different things. One, they will mark the feature location. Where is this thing? And this is where this is. So that can confirm that location. They also show the relationship of features. So maybe a point is to another point, or a point is to another line, or something relegated else within that base map. It shows that relationship between the data itself you're trying to show, as well as the extending environment. And then last, it also can symbolize the data that's related to the feature. So maybe there's something within the attribute information that's not immediately apparent given the location or anything else about that. But so adding a label might have a little bit way to go ahead and give a little bit more information within that. This particular example I like, I don't know if you can read it, but this woman has labeled her shoe, "My dog has chewed it." So much like visual hierarchy, we also have label hierarchy. So within the mapping elements, there's the whole visual hierarchy, but there's a whole separate hierarchy that exists for map labels as well. And so this was done on Axis Maps. He did a good job, and so I've recycled the information because I couldn't do better. But this map on the left shows an area where visual hierarchy does not really exist on the labels. It exists in the elements. You can see the lakes. You can see that there are lines of the states as applied, and so you can make out that figure ground, the mapping elements themselves. But in terms of understanding what is, you know, the Wisconsin text is the same text height as the Lake Winnebago, is the same style as the word Milwaukee, and so doing that actually makes it hard to discern which label belongs where, or what groupings can happen. So when you're looking at a map, your eye is doing a lot of work trying to figure out what belongs with what and what doesn't belong. It does these perceptual grouping strategies, and there's a whole study based off of perceptual grouping that can happen. But one of the ways that you can help your eyes or help your readers interpret things faster is applying hierarchy. And so the map on the right shows you what happens, how much more easily it is to digest this. You see that the word Wisconsin is now put in all caps and is a little bit larger than the word Milwaukee, which is now a different color, and yet again different color from the lakes. So as well as in the countries of the United States, America, and Canada are also labeled separately. So this way allows the viewer to be able to better sort and organize the information that's being presented. And so there are different cartographic standards for each type of label. And so we'll kind of take a look at some of that. The last thing I wanted to mention before I get to those standards is the general idea of placement. Placement is something that is time consuming. This is also known as map lettering. It can be one of the most important parts because if you do it wrong, you end up covering up information or making it harder for your map to understand. But doing it right can take time because usually the presets don't always cover everything that doesn't always work all the time. 60% of the time it works every time. But there are different rules that will apply, whether it's a point, line, or polygon. And you want to be having that cartographic task of the text placement will require kind of the instinctual knowledge to kind of guarantee quality and aesthetics. And then you want to be, again, still kind of thinking about your general rules about when to use them and when to overrule them. So this was just an unfortunate example of what happens when label placement goes poorly. But if we're thinking about point label guidelines, you want to be making sure, and some of these will seem relatively obvious, but nitty gritty is what we're good at. So you want to be selecting positions that avoid overprinting any of your graphics. So you don't necessarily want to be writing your label over your point or on top of anything else that is super important for the reader to understand. It also can be kind of hard to read your text potentially. You want to avoid putting any other map features in between the object and the label. So if I'm trying to label my yellow diamond, having that label show off to the left and still having a red hexagon in the middle now introduces a little bit of confusion. Am I putting this label on the red hexagon or the yellow diamond? It's unclear. If it's unavoidable that there's something that is going to be right there, you may want to be thinking about trying to use a halo, a mask, or a call out, even a simple leader line where it's just that small line that goes ahead to point out to that dot, anything to help the reader make a connection. That's fine, that's encouraged. Again, you're trying to enhance understanding and so don't necessarily let perfect be the enemy, but you want to make sure that what it is, the overall goal is what you're meeting, which is to go ahead and actually label that point. So multiple line labels should be broken out thoughtfully. So in this particular example here, I just went ahead and said Metro Library Downtown. This is all, I took 3 lines because I wanted it to be the fact that it'd be broken out. If I said Metro and then the next line said Library Downtown, that would just kind of look kind of weird and off. So lastly, you want to be placing them off to one side. You don't necessarily want it on the exact same line. That's something you want to try to avoid. You want to be putting it sort of like in a corner. And so this slide here will kind of show some of that. This is from one of the textbooks I use, where it can sort of show this poor type placement. You've got Meadville, again, that same line. Again, Flat City, same thing. And so what they've done is to either raise or lower based off of that placement. It just helps working on the eye. So those general ideas where you see the numbers on the boxes below are sort of where you want to be thinking about where can I put my label. If I want to break it down into 8 possible positions, I want to start with top right, and then if not, maybe top left. If not that, bottom right, bottom left, and then you look at the centers if it all fails. And if nothing else, well, okay, maybe I have to put it in the top center or bottom center. Those are just sort of the orders you would want to be thinking about. So again, you start at the center of the map, and then you're working outward. If you're thinking about lines, some of that would change up. You've got the place type above features where you want to be close but not touching. It's also okay, depending upon the stylistic, there are also good formats of actually putting it on the line, especially if it's a road. If the road, for example, if you're showing the outline of the road and perhaps it's a nice thick line, putting that label right in it is also encouraged. But so it is one of those you want to be thinking about making sure that you're not, again, overwriting that symbol with your text. But you really want to avoid placing it below the feature. If you're labeling like something with a complex curve, you want to follow that general trend of a feature. So if it's slowly arcing, then you'll sort of follow that slow arc rather than working through all of those S curves. Long linear features, highways, for example, may be labeled more than once. It's perfectly okay, also encouraged, because you don't want your reader doing the work of trying to trace that line all the way from one spot of the page to the other just to figure out if that's Route 35 or not. So you want to label water lines. That's sort of the general standard. You want to be putting them in blue and matching the color of that river blue, ideally. And putting that text in italics, or at least some sort of general shade. But that's sort of the general idea of how we're going to be labeling water features, and it helps. We're used to seeing that sort of thing. Again, same idea with the general trend. You don't want to curve any of your text too much. Again, it's work for the reader to have to kind of scooch around. That would be something that be kind of hard to read. Also, text should always be right side up, never upside down. Again, that same reason. Anything that's going to make your reader do a lot of work just to understand what it is that you're looking at is something that you want to be trying to avoid. So lastly, Polygon labeling guidelines. I really just picked going ahead and labeling the state of Kentucky because I think it encompasses just about everything labeled here. If your feature is large enough to contain the entire label, then you want to go ahead and try to visually center the label within the feature as much as you can. Obviously, if there's something else in that feature that it gets shown there, it's okay to move the label around. Ideally, you would have spacing on either side so that you're not trying to stretch it to fill the entirety of the space, but that's why you're not going to crowd that aerial symbol, that polygon. But you are going to try to at least give enough space on either side of that text. I think the general rule of thumb is something like 1.5 times, but sometimes that can maybe be a gold standard or something to shoot for. It's not something to really worry about mostly, but just the idea of having general spacing on either side. All uppercase type is appropriate here when you're looking at larger areas. And again, that idea of that exaggerated spacing, it may look natural here. This specific text I actually did up the space between that leading, sort of the leading between the letters here. And this I particularly did in InDesign just to do it, but Esri has the ability to do this as well. And so that there's a lot of space in between the actual letters rather than having them in their normal font. But I'm also not, typing K space, E space, N space. I am just going ahead and fixing that leading between the letters. So if I'm thinking about this in Map Viewer, go ahead, use the presets, and then start to think about, especially if this is going to be something printed off later, you want to be thinking, okay, which labels work, and then which ones do I need to fix? And so if I have labels that I want to fix, that's where I start using that edit label filter. And so I can start putting in expressions to treat my labels differently. So whether or not I want to be treating some of them and applying a different size, within the same class of that same layer rather than making a whole new layer, I can do that within this. If I have maybe one label that's just misbehaving and I want it gone, I would just filter that out. Or if I wanted to filter again to have the label text styles appear differently, I might go ahead and set something up maybe based off of anything else that might be in the attribute table, or just calling it out specifically and then working with those so that way I can go ahead and move them around the way I want. And how I move them around the way I want is in that label style where you see that offset X and offset Y, and playing around with those numbers will allow you to go ahead and move the label different from what the factory preset will give you. If it's on information that you really want a halo for, you can go ahead and do that as well. They will let you customize the color and the size of the halo here, not quite to the extent that Desktop or Pro would let you. I don't think they necessarily let you do fractions. I'm a big fan of being like 1.25 in a halo rather than like a 2 or like a 1.5. But this is at least something that to get you started. So that works there. And I've mentioned Map Viewer a couple of times. And so for those of you who have not yet made the switch, this is just a quick idea of where this is coming in. We've got the contents bar that will manage your contents. It's where you work on the map. It's where you add your layers, or you organize what layers are in your map, which ones you want to remove. And then you've got your settings toolbar, which is over on the right, and that's to stylize. So that's there configuring and interacting with the map layers. What colors, what type of way am I going to break out, what type of classes? Again, sort of some of those label things. Those are all happening then on your settings toolbar itself, and that's that configuring components piece. So one other technique that Map Viewer allows that we think is pretty cool, and this that is, I think, sort of the nexus of really cool. If I don't know what I'm doing, then I may end up having misunderstandings, is something called blending. And this is allowing areas where there are more than 2 layers, where pixels would normally be drawn on top of each other, or so the winner take all approach, like the table of contents we might remember. You can actually go ahead and blending them. And so this is, there's actually a couple dozen different ways that you can do it. All have their own complex algorithms behind it that I don't understand. But it allows a change for how colors and textures can appear. So the common example that we might have used was if you, really the transparency, the idea of, okay, I'm going to draw my population data, but I do want to see that some of the base map elements beneath it. How I might just go ahead and draw that transparency, but then all that does is it kind of washes out my color, it makes things lighter. It's still not ideal to do that. So having a blend could go ahead and allow where one layer might then be put into the fills of each other. And the beautiful thing about this is that the layers, you do not have to create a third permanent layer. It's still independent of each other. They still work with each other only in the confines of the map, and then you can break it, and then you're not actually changing any of your actual data off of that. So that's some of the benefits. I think it's got really great uses for both reference and thematic maps. It doesn't, I think, depending upon, again, whatever your data is that you're trying to show, if you're thinking about it thoughtfully, it's going to work for all kinds. The underlying data, again, remains unchanged, and so that's a really helpful thing when you're trying to, especially if some data you don't have permission to change. If you can make those more targeted changes rather than something, again, being uniformly applied. And it is something that generally is aesthetically pleasing and informative, assuming that you are using it correctly. And so this is an example based off of one of the blog posts that Esri had done, basically showing, here's a country's map, and then maybe this one makes it look a little bit more like a globe, where you would have your hill shade, you'd have elevation put into it. So now you start to see the Alps coming through. So taking on that same theme, that's really where I think this particular one, thinking about blending, it's important to show either your elements of the base map coming through or when elements from both layers are needed. So you want to be using it in a targeted approach. Don't just do it because it's cool. But if it's going to enhance the understanding, or if it's at the crux of understanding your map, that's when you're really going to want to be thinking about blending. So the one that is being shown here is something called Multiply, and they all have different names. But again, in your map viewer, you would put in the layers, the 2 layers that would need to it. So it's not something that you just take blending from the base map. You need 2 independent layers to do it. This one, for example, I've used the population data, and then I just pulled off Hillshade from the AGOL online files. This is not something I had on my site. I just searched for and added in the Hillshade. And then from there, in the properties, I wanted to go ahead and hit blending. The default is on normal. And instead, I went ahead and then decided to go through and finding this multiply is where it allows that hillshade to be shown while still maintaining the colors. So we can see here, this is a zooming in of the state of West Virginia. And maybe now we can start to see the areas that are super mountainous are the areas that also have the least amount of population. And so that probably kind of helps give a little bit more of an understanding about where we are. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. That was probably a lot to cover and sort of scattershot, but I find that design is something that tends to be overlooked a lot beyond just the really cool things we can do with some of the other technology. So here's some of the lower tech, lower fi stuff. So with that, I think we're done.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, Milo, and Tom. What a great presentation. I can't imagine how frustrating it must have been to try and take an entire semester's worth of cartographic and geovisualization techniques and cram them into an hour-long presentation.
Just 3 weeks. Don't worry, it's 3 weeks.
And when we have our discussion time later, I think I'm going to probably drag out some of the books that I have and make some recommendations about, because like Tom said, 40-year-old cartographic and geovisualization books work just as well now as the principles haven't changed. The tools have, but the principles certainly haven't changed. And in some ways, it's much easier to lie with maps than it used to be because it's so much easier for the layperson to generate thematic maps. So thank you so much about that. We do have a couple of minutes for Q&A, and I had a question. I had 2 questions specific to Map Viewer. So
Yeah.
I haven't made the, yes, Marc Mormonier, How to Lie with Maps, one of the very best books that I've ever read about cartography. I just saw that in the chat. So very good one, still relevant today. I believe that he's put out a second one as well.
Yes.
So as far as Map Viewer and Web App Builder, so they're not built off of the same JavaScript API, which means that they're not going to work together. And I keep hearing Esri say that Experience Builder is going to replace Web App Builder, but I find it to be sorely lacking. So with the exception of when I'm only creating web maps that I share internally, I have not actually used the Map Viewer because I can't create apps to share externally in that way. So can you talk a little bit about your experience with that so far?
I'll let Tom. Do you want to start with some of
Yeah,
that? Everything you said is correct.
Yeah, I mean, our experience has been the same. I've only found that there are some really intriguing new abilities in that new map viewer, but if you're going to leave that environment, then it impacts what we can do with it right now, because there's certain widgets and things we're very used to. We put a lot of web app builder stuff and we really like it, and I don't think it's going to go away. And I know that we've also done some work with Experience Builder, and there's no doubt that'll expand, but they're just, you know, Esri has a long history of kind of being in between with stuff. You know, ArcGIS Pro is that same sort of thing. That's been around for like 7 years now, and there's still people that find they can't do certain things there that they could in ArcMap desktop. But I think it's good to experiment with that and look at some of those things. If you have a very specific web map for a specific task, you can take it to the next level and do things you can't, like the way Catherine showed with the regular classic viewer. So why not take advantage of that, right?
It's just been a difficult kind of, I mean, I want to make the jump because the cartographic techniques are amazing. Like these are things that we've been trying to do with web maps for the last 7 years and we can't. So the other thing
the only other thing I would add to that is I think that is a universal problem. Like it's an issue that we see in this, but it's also an issue in terms of some of their older applications. For example, we're trying to do an update one of our other applications, but because they're trying to move all the story maps into the new version, not all the functionalities or the workarounds that I was able to do in the older ones are in the new one. And so I'm unfortunately having to update the old one, which they don't want me to do because that functionality I still need. So I think that's something I'm hoping. I don't know nothing, but I would assume that because this seems to be this is a industry-wide issue between any product is such a almost overarching problem that's the type of thing they should be focusing on. So here's hoping.
So, yeah. And then with conditional logic and label expression, or I'm sorry,
Yeah.
when using Arcade to do label expressions in the new map viewer, does it support conditional logic yet?
I will need to double check on some of that. Some of the simpler stuff. I mean, but yeah, there's the Boolean stuff is a little bit mix and match on that. So I tend to like to do more of that in the Map Viewer Classic end part, but the being able to filter out the placements and being able to I'm trying to remember going back through what it actually showed in terms of my menu because I don't have it out in front of me because there was like one other thing in there that I don't remember seeing in there, no, I can't quite remember where it is. But yeah, so again, and to me, and I'm I like the desktop or the Pro has the most control. So that's really, if you're making maps there, that's where you get the most design bang for your buck. I feel like the web maps are now moving up a step closer to that. They're not equal, and I don't know when that will be, but.
And it's really confusing too. Like if you publish from Pro into a hosted feature layer in ArcGIS Online, oftentimes it will actually retain the font that you're using in Pro, yes. But it doesn't always. And so it's really confusing. Because sometimes I'm like, oh, that looks great. That's amazing. And then I'm like, wait, I didn't do that. Yeah. So, well, thank you so much for this presentation. Are there any other questions before we take a brief break before our next one?
I need like a whole class, like a whole semester on labeling.
It's not too late to sign up. I start teaching in January. That's when my class is offered.
You could join me as well.
true. We've got a lot of people who are keen on passing along information to our next generation of GIS professionals. Oh, that sounded really hokey. I can't believe I just said that.